Thank you so much for coming out tonight. Welcome to the Korea Society. If this is your first time, I see some familiar faces too. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the best-selling and award-winning author, Angie Kim. Born in Seoul, Korea, and raised in Baltimore, Angie practiced law, worked in management consulting, created a startup, and was a full-time parent before she became a writer. Her debut novel, Miracle Creek, won the Edgar Award, the ITW Thriller Award, the Strand Critics Award, and the Pink Leaf Prize, and was named one of the best books of the year by Time Magazine, The Washington Post, Kirkus Review, and The Today Show. Her new book is Happiness Falls, one of the most anticipated books of the season, a New York Times bestseller, and a Good Morning America Book Club pick for September. Joining Angie tonight for this conversation is Susan Choi, the esteemed author of many award-winning novels such as The Foreign Student, American Woman, A Person of Interest, My Education, and Truth Exercise, which won the 2019 National Book Award for Fiction. Woo. You will have a chance to ask your own questions to Angie later this evening. If you're joining us for the live webcast, you can send your questions via email, artsandculture@koreasociety.org. Angie and Susan will also be signing a copy of Miracle Falls and Truth Exercise after the program, and we'd like to thank You and Me Books for handling the sales tonight. Once again, if you're joining us online, Miracle Falls is available everywhere books are sold, including You and Me Bookstore's own website. And now, please welcome Angie Kim and Susan Choi.
Thanks to everybody for coming. Angie and I have a lot of great energy worked up already. We ran here through the hailstorm. Angie, will you read to us a little bit?
Yeah, okay, I will.
From Happiness Falls.
I will. And I will go, I'll read a little bit from the beginning. And I will read from part 1, Everyone's Fine. Spoiler alert, everyone is not fine. Chapter 1, Lock, Bach, and K-pop. We didn't call the police right away. Later, I would blame myself. Wonder if things might have turned out differently if I hadn't shrugged it off, insisting Dad wasn't missing, but just delayed. Probably still in the woods looking for Eugene, thinking he'd run off somewhere. Mom says it wasn't my fault, that I was merely being optimistic, but I know better. I don't believe in optimism. I believe there's a fine line, if any, between optimism and willful idiocy. So I try to avoid optimism altogether, lest I fall over the line mistakenly. My twin brother John keeps trying to make me feel better too, saying we couldn't have known something was wrong because it was such a typical morning, which is such an asinine thing to say because why would you assume things can't go wrong simply because they haven't yet? Life isn't geometry. Terrible life-changing moments don't happen predictably at the bottom of a linear slope. Tragedies and accidents are tragic and accidental precisely because of their unexpectedness. Besides, labeling anything about her family typical, I just have to shake my head. I'm not even thinking about the typical adjacent stuff like John's and my boy-girl twin thing, our biracial mix, Korean and white, untraditional parental gender roles, working mom, stay-at-home dad, or different last names. Parson for dad plus Park for mom equals the mashed up Parkson for us kids. Not common, certainly, but hardly shocking in our area these days. Where we're indubitably, inherently atypical, is with my little brother Eugene's dual diagnosis, autism and a rare genetic disorder called mosaic Angelman syndrome, which means he can't talk, has motor difficulties, and this is what fascinates many people who've never heard of Angelman, has an unusually happy demeanor with frequent smiles and laughter. I think that's enough. Yeah.
I have so many questions for Angie, but I want to begin by actually reminding both of us that the first time Angie and I ever met for an event for Miracle Creek was on Zoom.
It was.
So this is awesome.
I know. And it wasn't just for Miracle, it was for Trust Exercise too. We were discussing both of them together.
That's right.
And we had like a thunderstorm that night too.
That's
I
right.
think.
And
it was really
your
bizarre.
electricity almost went out.
Yes.
And it was
did.
truly crazy. Like there was a crazy sort of disturbance in the heavens
Yes.
when we came together, which clearly
And then it happened again
is a
as
thing.
like we both had all these issues, including an EMS emergency on your train that made us think she might not make it tonight. So
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also like strange meteorological disturbances. So just be careful because when we are in conjunction,
yeah.
this is very intense.
It really is. Okay, I feel like strange meteorological disturbances might be an excellent title.
Okay, that's your next book.
Like I feel, or yours, or we could do a collaborative. Okay, but anyway.
So that I had to say. The other thing that I want to say to everyone in the audience, if you haven't yet read this book, block an afternoon because actually it's very, very difficult to stop reading it. And you will, if you have the afternoon to read it, you will read the entire book. I was incredibly angry actually to have to prepare dinner for a dependent child 2 hours into this book. Like, my resentment was seething. I was like, can we just wrap this up quickly? The book is marvelous.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I have so many questions, but I want to start with Eugene, who you mentioned
Yes.
as you were reading. Eugene is really important to this story. Eugene is not the narrator.
No.
The narrator whose voice you just heard as Angie was reading is Mia. So will you say a little bit about first, who is Eugene and why is Eugene not narrating?
Yeah. So there are so many answers to that question, but the story in a nutshell for those who haven't read it or heard about it is it's a story about a family in crisis. And it opens with a father of this biracial Korean American family in Northern Virginia, much like my own, going missing. I said this last night, and my husband was at the launch, and he was like, "Yeah, that would be me." But anyway, and when he goes missing, the only person who might have seen him is Eugene, the 14-year-old that Susan just asked about. And he has a rare genetic condition called Angelman syndrome and a dual diagnosis with that along with autism, which renders him unable to talk. And so he was the only person who was with a father and who might know what happened to him. And so even if he desperately wants to tell us what, and the police and the family, what happened to the father, he can't. And so the family really has to come together and they really have to figure out how to connect with each other and find out the father's secrets, if he had any, and spoiler alert, again, he does. And then we really do have to figure out how to connect with Eugene to find out what he knows and what he's willing to tell us. And he's so important because he's sort of at the crux of the mystery, but also because of his inability to talk, which is just something that I'm really interested in, and vis-a-vis the very hyperlexic, hyperverbal Mia, who is our narrator.
Mia, who is the narrator and the sister of Eugene.
Yeah, yes.
And yes, she's hyperlexic, hyperverbal, extremely accomplished as a talker. Boy, can she talk. She's an amazing narrator. And that's, I think, part of the momentum of the book is that it's in Mia's voice. But one of the things that I love so much that the book unpacks is this bias. So Mia's really interested in bias.
Yeah.
And one of the biases that she talks about that I'm still thinking about is this bias that aligns super talky verbal with smart.
Yes.
So can you talk more about like that bias and why it's important?
Yeah, and I feel like it's really cool that I'm getting to talk about it here at the Korea Society in particular, because it really does originate from my experience being a Korean immigrant. So I was born and raised in Korea. I came over to the US as an 11-year-old in middle school, and I didn't speak English. And overnight, I went from someone who, was considered smart, who did well in school. I felt like I had friends. I was gregarious. I, talked a lot. Sometimes I got in trouble for talking too much. all of that sort of stuff. And then overnight, I couldn't say anything. And the frustration of that, and more than the frustration, which is sort of, one of these practical things, like if you go to a country where you don't know, the language, of course there's going to be impracticality. But it went beyond that. It was shame. And I think that was the first time I realized we as a society, not just the American society, but just like sort of the world over, including me, we have this assumption that's very deeply seated that says that oral fluency is equivalent to intelligence. We just think it. I don't know why we think it. Um, and I found myself thinking of myself as stupid. I became a babo, which is a Korean word for a stupid person, overnight. And I just thought, how did this come to be? And it was something that I could try to talk myself out of, but I couldn't because it was that deeply seated. And so it's something that I've just been thinking a lot about. And then fast forward to when I was a mother and I had children. All three are fine now, but they all had medical issues as kids. And through that experience of mothering, I found a group of mothers in the DC area with children some of whom are quote unquote nonverbal. And it was really interesting because we had all assumed, again, that they were cognitively deficient and that they truly were nonverbal. They didn't have words. And then it turned out that some of them learned a type of communication method where they sort of point to words letter by letter on a letterboard, which is a very slow, painstaking process, and learn to communicate. And when they did that, all these amazing thoughts sort of flowed out of them. And it turned out they were not cognitively deficient at all. They were just trapped in there. And so I think when that happened, it just made me sort of realize this is something that I really want to explore and try to figure out why we have this assumption in our society. And so I wrote, which is what I do when I don't know why something is the way it is.
Yeah, it's incredible too, because when you were describing Eugene's role and the fact that he's the last person with Mia and Eugene and John's dad before Adam vanishes, and that the family has to kind of engage with Eugene to figure out what he knows. It's not even that simple, right? Because the family actually has some difficulty even realizing that Eugene does know something.
Yeah.
They kind of assume that he doesn't know anything. So can you talk a little bit, without spoiling too much, about the family's journey? Because they're forced to reckon with an enormous bias that they've had against Eugene, their beloved Eugene.
Yes. And that's, I think, what's so painful for the family is that, Mia, for example, she loves her brother. Is fiercely protective over him. And so when she realizes that maybe she has been treating him as a babo, as a baby, who can't think and who doesn't understand words and language and who doesn't understand what's happening, she has to really grapple with that. There is so much shame and guilt in that as well. And that she has really gone around underestimating him. And not just her, but the entire family. His teachers, the police certainly do that. And so that's something that they have to grapple with. And I think it's, in a way, it's something that our society is going through right now, because we're sort of coming to grips with ableism. And, in the same way that we did and are continuing to with, racism and gender dynamics and all sorts of different things. And I feel like this is the kind of thing that they think that they're enlightened and they think that they have been treating him fairly, and then when they realize that they haven't, it's just this crushing blow, you know?
Right.
And it's just so emotional for them.
Right. Yeah, that's what I think is so extraordinary about being with this family in this story. There's so many crises that they're confronting, but one of them is this crisis of realizing that they're actually not as great as they thought they were when it comes to their treatment of Eugene. I mean, one of them, John like works in the educational sort of setting that Eugene goes to, and all of them are incredibly intellectually engaged with the whole question of how to make the best possible life for Eugene, and none of them are actually seeing him.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maybe one of them is seeing him. I wanted to, without spoiling too much, I wanted you to talk a little bit about the word happiness because it's in the title.
Yeah.
It's an interesting and compelling idea for us all. I think we all have very special associations with happiness, but it has a very special role in the
story. And one of the reasons why the story was actually originally called Happiness Quotient, which is in the story pretty early on. And it's a concept that the missing father, Adam, has been obsessed with for a long, long time. And it's a concept that I've been obsessed with for a long, long time. And I think it, again, goes back to my time as a Korean immigrant and being in Korea. We were so poor. We had no running water. We lived in one room of another family's house. And when we found out that we were getting a visa to come to the U.S., I remember everybody saying, it's like you won the lottery, you know? And I felt it, and we were really excited. And so I came.
You'll be so happy.
Right? And so I came, and, and sure enough, there were all these things that I had never even dreamed of before. Like we had color TVs and refrigerators and toilets and showers and all these things. And I remember thinking like, okay, I'm supposed to be happy. I'm supposed to be happy. I'm supposed to be happy. And yet being miserable. And partly it was that shame of, being less than as far as linguistically and ethnically being an other and being outside the mainstream and not being normal, which when you're 11, all you want to be is normal. And I also missed my parents because they were working so hard. And I never got to see them. So it was that loss. And so it made me start thinking about what happiness means, objective versus subjective levels of happiness, and sort of micro versus macro. And so how it relates to the family and how it comes back to this family's journey is that the family finds out that the father, Adam, has been really obsessed with trying to quantify happiness so that he can help to maximize it for his family members whom he loves so much. He's the stay-at-home father, he's the caretaker, he's the anchor. And one of the things that they learn is that there is a genetic study going on, and this is a real thing, for Angelman syndrome. Angelman syndrome is caused by a genetic mutation or deletion. There are different types, some kind of an error. And so they're trying to fix that. And so they're doing studies about it. And it's fascinating because Adam comes across some of these debates that say, should we really be doing this? Why should we be doing it? Because like we were talking about it in the introduction, one of the hallmarks of Angelman syndrome is that the children seem very, very happy. They're constantly smiling and laughing. So outside manifestations of happiness. And so a lot of people are asking, why should we fix or cure this so-called defect when what that does is make our children happy? Isn't that what we want for our kids? We were talking about this at dinner, with drinks tonight. We were just saying, that's what we want for, that's the first thing that you want for your kids is happiness, for them to be happy. So why fix somebody who seems happy like Eugene and make him into a normal, typical teenager who is kind of surly and doesn't seem all that happy and, is depressed and has high rates of suicide and things? Why would we want that?
Yeah.
And so the father is really grappling with that and grappling with issues of, well, there's micro hedonistic types of happiness where you could be sitting on the couch and like eating bonbons all day and watching Seinfeld or whatever, and laughing, and you might seem to be happy. And you probably might say that you had a happy day if you did that one day. But if you did that every single day, would you think at a macro level that that's the kind of like satisfying life that you want for yourself, for your children? So it's these types of issues of defining happiness and trying to achieve happiness and increasing it that Adam is really, really grappling with.
Yeah. Yeah. And also the whole idea of what the norm or the context is that you are occupying and what happiness means in that context. And this might be kind of a leap, although like my brain made it, so hopefully everyone can follow. But one of the other things that's fascinating to me about Happiness Falls as a novel is it's take it from me, an incredibly compelling novel in which you basically like can't stop turning the pages, even if your surly teenage child is asking for dinner. And at the same time, it's this amazingly sort of trenchant exploration of what storytelling means to us. Like, what are stories for? What is their function? And not just, I don't mean stories like novels and movies, but I mean the stories that we live by, our ideas of ourselves, all of our kind of cultural agreements. All of these things are stories too. And Mia, our wonderful narrator who, in addition to being hyper fluent, is also like kind of hyper intellectual. Like she's always doing deep dives into this or that. And she's really interested in this question of like, what are stories for? Because in the story, everyone's trying to figure out what the story is of what happened to Adam. What is that story? So the police come, the police are like, we're investigating. Here's the evidence we see. And they're starting to form a story.
Yeah.
Some of their stories are not, the family's like, no, we don't like that story.
Yeah.
There's a lot of concern with, is the story going to be harmful? Is it going to be helpful? But Mia's also thinking about how, like, Joan Didion said, we tell ourselves stories in order to live, like the necessity of stories to us, but also the danger.
Yeah.
The danger of stories.
Yeah.
The stories we tell ourselves that make us assume things that actually aren't accurate.
Absolutely.
How did you tell such a good story while also unpacking the nature of stories themselves?
Oh, thank you.
Were you thinking like, oh no, I'm telling too compelling of a story?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it came from Mia, right? Because her voice has been with me for like 13 years. So I wrote a short story when I first started writing in my 40s. I wrote a short story in her voice as a 14-year-old. She was 14 at that time. And it was one of the first short stories that I wrote. And so that voice has been with me all along, and the family has been with me all along. And so, for example, when my kids, who are around her age, and she and John are fraternal twins, and when my kids were going through a college admissions process, for example, I would be thinking to myself, like, I wonder where Mia would be applying to school, and like I wonder if she's getting in, and like I wonder what her college essay is, and so that voice has been with me. And when I started writing the story, I would find, because she has such a strong opinionated voice, it kind of sort of got away from me from time to time, and I would find myself as sort of the writer trying to be disciplined, sort of thinking about, okay, where are we in the story now? And, kind of taking a step back and kind of like telling Mia, like, okay, we need to just like get off that and get back to, the real story, which is the dad, or whatever. And so it did make me start thinking about this idea of what the role of a story is, And it also comes from the fact that the police were involved and the lawyer was involved. So, the family had to hire a lawyer to try to protect Eugene from the police. And the lawyer is actually trying to school them on, here are the stories that we have to tell, and here's how we have to tell it. And here are the elements of the story that we need to make sure are present and are not present. And so she starts deconstructing it in her mind because that's what she does. She's that kind of a person. And so it just sort of became a natural way, sort of like a push and pull of her as the narrator and then all these other characters. And then in some distant way, like me as the author going like, okay, what are we doing here, Mia? Kind of thing.
I mean, it's so, well, first of all, I'm being reminded of Miracle Creek, actually, because there's a similar kind of incredible competition of different plausible explanations in that book. One of the things I love about this book, which reads like a thriller, is that you don't engage in any of the kind of manipulative storytelling tricks of a thriller. It reads like a thriller because you can't stop turning the pages and trying to figure out what happens. But Mia even says at one point, she says, like, I just had to give up twisty thriller-like stories because she keeps trying to tell a story to herself that makes sense of the evidence, that makes sense of what's happening. And so at some point I thought, like, oh my God, Angie's a genius because she's figured out how to write something that feels like a thriller, but it doesn't cheat in any way. And my theory is that the way that you do this is we're inside of Mia, who's constantly kind of trying to make sense of what's happening and telling herself these stories. And we're like, is this the right story? Is this the right story? And you just do such a brilliant job of putting us into that suspensefulness that she's experiencing.
Right. And that was exactly, thank you so much for saying that. That's exactly what I wanted to happen. So the way that I write, and this comes from, and you and I have talked about this too, about our theater backgrounds. So we both have theater backgrounds, as anybody who read Trust Exercise will recognize and know.
Very, very meager theater background.
No. But I went to a boarding school similar to the one in Trust Exercise. I went to Interlochen for theater. And I was actually there last week dropping off my baby for his, okay, I'm not gonna think about it. All right, but anyway. But so I did a lot of method acting work, and that's sort of what I was schooled in. And so I sort of do this method writing where I really try to stay in the character's head as much as possible. And it's not until I'm done with a scene or a chapter and I'm really happy with it that I sort of step back and I read it sort of with my author's hat on, with like the Angie Kim hat on instead of the Mia hat on, and sort of like think to myself, okay, where are we in the story? And, story structure, because I'm also a geek about story structure. But when I was writing the story, I really found myself sort of in Mia's head in that way and really wondering and then sometimes going off on these tangents that had nothing to do with her concerns about her father, and then feeling guilty that, she wasn't thinking about her dad and she was maybe thinking about her boyfriend instead, or, whatever, or epistemology or linguistics or, whatever. And so it was one of these things that was so interesting to me, that she would consider all of these possibilities and really analytically try to think, okay, out of all of these hypotheses of what could have possibly happened to my father, which is the worst from my perspective, from Eugene's perspective, from the police's perspective, and try to be really analytical in that way. Because in a way, she's trying to distance herself and try to view it in a rational way too, which I found myself trying to do too, because sometimes it's just too painful.
It ends up being, I think, a really extraordinary portrait of grief.
Yeah.
Which I don't want to actually maybe describe any further because I want readers to experience it. But I know that we're time is flying, and I have like all these bullet points where I'm like, things I have to talk about. You mentioned I love like having the Mia hat on and kind of doing like sorry everybody about my mic, a sort of a method acting-y approach to trying to figure out like what's the story, what is Mia experiencing, how is she going to process this information, and the intricacy of this plot. There are many, many competing explanations. What happened to our dad is like the incredibly compelling kickoff for this book. This is page 1. Where's our dad? And, I can't imagine many people who would be able to stop reading once they read the first page. But you had so many different elements that are you immerse the reader so beautifully in Mia's bewilderment, her efforts to make sense of all this stuff, but all the while you, Angie, are in complete authorial control, which is like very hard to do, like to give the reader the sense of the bewilderment of the protagonist, but you're controlling it so that we know we're in good hands with you. And I remember when we did our event for Miracle Creek, I said, what is up with you anyway? Do you just have like a wall of Post-it notes? Is that how you keep track of your plot? And you were like,
no, not at all. Well,
so how say more about your writing process.
Yeah.
You've talked about embodying Mia, but like tell us more about how this happens.
Well, I mean, so I outline as I go along. So we talked about how I do have all these like crazy things going on.
To keep track of where you are.
Right, but after I've written the scene, so just to sort of remind myself of where I'm going. But I think, to what you were saying about how the reader is surprised about what's happening and some of the turns that are happening and some of the sort of hypotheses and the different explanations that they're trying to find in what happened to the father. That's partly because I myself had no idea. So I don't outline. I wish I could. I mean, doesn't it seem like, but Susan, don't you think that it would be so nice?
I'm secretly so happy right now. But
okay, but don't you think it would be so nice to like be one of those writers? And I know some of you are out there. I'm like looking at some of you, and I'm like, I am like giving you the evil eye. And to be one of these people who like knows what the plot is and like what's gonna happen. Like, no, it would be secretly.
With those people, though?
No, I know they're really. I really don't like them very much. But no, it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, and you already have the puzzle pieces. And so, like, to me, I wish I could do that, but I have no idea. So I really had no idea what happened to the father. And I really like this father. Like, he's, I've been thinking about him for like 13 years. And so I was like, I hope he's alive. I don't know. I don't know what's happened to him. Maybe he did run away. Maybe he's doing some weird happiness experiment on the whole family, trying to like lower their expectations, then make them think that he's dead and something horrible's happened. And then he's going to come back and pop alive and we are going to be so happy. That's like, so that was kind of my like.
We're not going to tell you which of these
No,
things
of course
is.
not. Yeah, it could be that. So let's hope. So I had all of these thoughts, and then I thought the only way that I can actually find out is by writing. So that's like my main motivation. That's like my main writing craft advice for anybody who's like me and who's a procrastinator, which is have no idea what's going to happen and yet really want to know. So it's almost like you're putting on your reader hat, and you really want to know, like you want to keep going and, and reading that amazing book, and just like pull an all-nighter to find out what happens. Well, it's like that, except that you're the writer. So you have to just keep on writing and actually get your butt in gear, like day after day in order to actually figure it out. So that's sort of,
I'm glad you don't know how to outline in advance.
Really?
No, I mean, I'm sitting here actually inventing a theory of great storytelling. And my theory is that I'm not saying that the writers who outline, and if you're in the audience, like, I don't resent you at all. And I'm sure you struggle in other ways. But
yes.
I do think that there's a connection between the sense of mystery you're describing that you're compelled to solve about your characters, what befalls them, and how incredibly like lived and embodied and real these characters feel. These characters feel so real. It's strange to me that we're talking about Mia as a character, because I really do think of Mia maybe the way you do.
Right.
You've known Mia for 13 years. She's actually 20, but
Yeah.
or maybe by now she's 22. I'm
Yeah,
not sure, but
yeah,
like
yeah.
these characters really feel alive on the page, and I don't know if they would if you were one of those writers who had like plotted it all out in advance and had your outline and you were like checking your boxes as you went, which is a thing I think of as being very necessary to nonfiction.
Yeah.
But I do think fiction,
there's a magic element.
there's a
right?
magical
There's a magic
discovery element
Yeah.
to it.
And there's also like, I really do believe in this, and I do believe in this from sort of method acting and theater and performance, which is that if you feel it, the audience can tell. Like, you can't fake it. You
Yeah.
can't just have, you can have the vocal tone be the same in a way. And Mia actually talks about this. I can't remember what context she talks about it in, but she says, like, there's a thing where, you know, a robot who's looking at two people, making the same gestures and having the same facial expressions and with the same tonal, like, you know, differences and whatever, that a robot may not be able to tell the difference because they're going to be technically the same, but that if you feel it, you're going to, like, the humans, the audience is going to know. And I feel the same way with fiction readers. I really feel like if you are feeling it,
Yeah.
the reader knows. Like, you can't just fake it. Like,
Yeah.
I think, you know.
I agree. And I'm wondering if you, as your own first reader, also have that experience of, I mean, I'm afraid that you're going to say this never happens, but do you ever write a scene that doesn't work?
Absolutely.
Ever?
Yeah.
And if so, like, how do you know?
You know, and that's one of the great mysteries, right? I don't know that you know. Well, I don't know. I have no
Well,
idea.
you know, because you don't have any in this book.
Oh, thank
So
you.
you must
No.
have taken them out.
No, but
Someone must have noticed.
Okay, but you know who knows is David Ebershoff, who's my editor. I'm looking at him right now. And so there were times when David, it was really kind of early on. It was like towards, like in the first half of the book, where I wrote something and I was like, this doesn't feel right. And I just was like, okay, I'm going to go back. And then I wrote it a different way. And I was thinking that, like, I felt like that was the right way, but I felt like the first way was like more compelling, like from a plot perspective, but it just didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain it. So I sent it to David and I was like, can you read these two alternate things? And he was like, oh, definitely number 2. Like, he didn't even have to think about it. And I love that confidence because I don't have it. Like, I'm always second guessing myself. So that was like a huge gift. Yeah. So that was great. Thank you.
I love that you just drew our attention to the audience, because we do want to take questions, and it is that time where I have not asked all my questions, but I know that the audience has questions too. Perhaps they will ask my remaining ones, and if not, I'll ask my remaining questions. But yeah, I knew you guys would have questions.
First of all, congratulations on hitting the New York Times bestseller list this week.
Yay! Thank you, Andy.
Can you just tell us a little bit about the moment you found out and how that went?
Oh, the moment. Oh, it was so fun. I love that my team is here. So we found out on Tuesday night, and I was driving to Sykesville, Maryland. No, Westminster, Maryland, to my first in-person event. And at 5:01, David, my editor, called me. And he knew that I was driving. And he tried to call my agent, Susan, who's sitting right there, but we couldn't get her because I don't know why. Oh, that's right. You were in the subway. And he said, I have news. And I was like, oh, God. Because I knew, you know, what Wednesday at 5 o'clock means. And then he said, but I'm here with Andy, who is our publisher. And we have good news. And I was like, what? And I think I like screeched a little bit, but I was trying to like be calm because I was driving.
David, she was driving.
I was driving. I was trying to be
Unsafe.
responsible. And it was great. And it was really funny because he told me something that had happened the previous day that like made him kind of know that, and he was like, but I didn't want to give you false expectations, per the whole happiness quotient thing in the book. And so it was really sweet. And then my whole team like was in there. I don't know if they were there the whole time or if they came in at some point. And then they were popping the champagne that actually I had given them like a long time ago, like 4 months ago or something. And I said, hey guys, but like, here's something for the whole team. And I gave them like all these chocolates and stuff too, just to thank them for their hard work. And I said, the next time anything good happens and fun, I want you to pop this open and just, enjoy it. And I thought they were going to be like, oh, we got, I don't know, like we got our cover, yay! So we would pop open. No, but they were saving it the whole time. And apparently they saved until that moment. And then they were popping it open and like hollering and laughing and clapping. And it was very nice. And I was trying not to cry because I needed to be able to see. And if I cry, my contacts do weird things. So yeah, it was really fun. Thank you, Andy.
It's an excellent answer. Over here.
Congratulations again.
Oh, thank you.
In the book, there's a line, hope is dangerous that way. And I've written that line in my own book before.
Oh, wow.
So it really grabbed me. I was wondering if you think that other people feel that way, that hope is dangerous when you have it.
I do think that. I think Mia certainly thinks that. She talks about in what I read in the earlier line that there being a very fine distinction, if any, between hope and willful idiocy. And it's not that I don't believe in hope. I certainly do. I'm a very I don't know if I'm optimistic. I don't know. I'm very schizophrenic. I go back and forth, but I do think that I'm a relatively cheerful person and relatively happy person. But I do think that there's something to what the father is describing as far as something that's dangerous is having just sort of such a high hope and then having that hope be unmet, that expectation be unmet, and how that can create some of the most depressing, awful feelings that you can have. And so, and I've experienced that in, I'm sure we all have in different ways. And so I think that's the context in which I think that it can be dangerous. And so when you have hope, even though it can make you feel good in the moment, you just have to be careful in the future. Now, one of the things that the father also says is, and Eugene actually kind of points this out to him towards the end when we do get access to his thoughts and what he's thinking. He points out that, yes, that's true, but also at the same time, if you are so cynical about what's going to happen tomorrow, and so if you have very low expectations, then tomorrow may be happier, but boy, is today gonna suck. So, so in that way, the opposite can be true too, So I think it calls for sort of a moderation and also maybe having hope, but always and maybe high expectations too, and having ambition and all of that, but at the same time having keeping that baseline view of your life and keeping that baseline view of your life in a low way. So like I was doing that a lot this week. And last week too, like just sort of throughout my entire publishing journey, sort of thinking to myself, okay, like I have to make sure that my baseline view of myself is not as like this person who, published a debut novel that won awards and, was a bestseller and all that kind of stuff. But as somebody remembering back to my true baseline as a writer, which is when I started writing a story and not knowing if I was ever going to be able to finish. Because I think we all have that as writers, right? Like you write a story and you have no idea if you're going to be able to complete it. And that moment, like when I had finished it, my debut, but I hadn't found an agent yet. I didn't have a book deal. I didn't have all of these things. And so really keeping that view of myself and trying to sort of moderate my expectations vis-a-vis that, if that makes sense. Yeah.
I just like Susan said, I found this book so incredibly compelling, and I also found that it taught me a lot of things, and the things that it taught me I think about as I walk around, that it sort of changed my way of seeing things. I know you just talked about the kind of ideas that have propelled you for a long time, or the obsessions you've had, or the values you've had that you've put into this, the idea of a baseline, or the idea of how verbal fluency, connects or is perceived by other people, the biases we hold. I wonder if also you could tell us a little bit about what writing it taught you or changed in you, or what you sort of carry with you now that you've finished the project that you didn't have before.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, hi, Julia. And everybody, that's Julia Phillips, who is a really good friend of mine. And I didn't recognize at first because the light is in my eyes. So that's why I was like, wow, that voice sounds so familiar. And Julia also has like an incredible novel called Bear coming out next year. So also from Hogarth. So I just want to give that a plug. But okay, anyway, so what I learned, I mean, I think that's, like I talked about with respect to the father not knowing that sort of mystery. When I first started writing this book, I had this Venn diagram up on it's still actually up on my writing wall, and it had 3 circles. And one circle was the mystery of the missing father. The second circle was the verbal fluency thing. And the third circle was the happiness quotient. And sort of where they intersected was supposed to be the ending. And so hopefully that works for everybody, and that does come together. I didn't know what the ending was going to be. I just knew that somehow it was going to kind of sort of come all together into that. And I didn't know, just like I said, I didn't know what the mystery of the missing father was. I didn't know the other things either. I didn't know. I really was writing to try to figure out, why do we have, as a society, have this assumption about verbal fluency being equivalent to intelligence. And I also didn't really know what the role of optimism and sort of the relativity of happiness, and using the concept of the relativity of happiness in order to try to maximize happiness, if that's even possible. I didn't know what that was. So those were sort of the 3 core mysteries that I was trying to figure out by writing this book. And with respect, so I've talked a little bit about, well, I'm not going to give away anything about the mystery of the missing father, because you guys all have to read it to find out. And the oral fluency, there's a lot of cognitive bias assumptions and linguistics and things in there too. But with respect to happiness, I really do think that this writing it did enable me to kind of figure out how to sort of moderate these warring impulses in myself anyway, just like I talked about with respect to sort of this publication process. And with respect to so many other things, like when my kids were going through the college admissions process and all of that sort of stuff. And because when I started writing this, I really was thinking about sort of the relativity of happiness as, it's as simple as, in order to increase your happiness, you have to just lower your expectations. Your happiness level is like whatever you experience divided by your expectations. So therefore, just mathematically, if you just, lower your expectations, then your happiness level is going to be higher, So that just seems so simple. And I have these Excel spreadsheets, like with all of these scenarios, and it's really kind of ridiculous. But, and it really made sense. But then when I was writing the scenes, Eugene made this point about, but if you lower your expectations and you think, God, this movie is going to be horrible that I have to go see tomorrow, or, my book is coming out tomorrow and, oh my God, everybody's going to hate it and it's going to suck, then you're going to be really miserable right now. And so, I really wrote trying to figure that out, and then really thinking about, okay, it's not the expectation. You can still be excited. You can still tell your kids, yeah, you should reach for your dream school or whatever. but at the same time, just really taking care to remember where that original baseline is, so that when you get a new job or a promotion, you don't immediately get used to that and think of yourself in that role, but continue to remember back to the beginning so that you continue to want what you have instead of wanting what you don't have, like always remembering that what you have is something that you want, and appreciating that. So it sounds very like happiness labby, so we'll stop that right now.
Hi, Angie. Congratulations.
Oh my God, hi.
Hi. I loved Miracle Creek. I can't wait to read this book.
Oh, thank you.
And I wanted to ask just like a nerdy process question. So I'm actually an outliner, but I feel like I often have to disrespect the outline in order to like progress in the story. And I was just curious about like, as you're writing, do you have like beta readers that you tend to show along the way? And how does that feedback kind of influence the trajectory of the story, if it does?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I have so many beta readers. I think I'm gonna actually cut that out a little bit because I think it got a little bit in my head actually. So I have 2 writing groups. I have an in-person writing group that I've been with for like 12 years. Last night, my DC launch was at the Writer Center, which is where I started taking classes because I don't have an MFA, and I started taking like short fiction classes and personal essay classes and stuff there. So that was really special. And my writing group was there, and that's where we met, by taking classes. And so I use that group mostly as a deadline thing. Like every other month, I say, I'm going to give you a new scene or chapter. And because I care about, how they think of me as a writer, I, actually try to produce produce things that I think are not horrible. And then and then I also have another writing group that's in like Zoom mode, and they read my book once it was done. I think they read like a little bit in the beginning, just to sort of see if there was any feedback. Maybe before I gave my first chunk to my editor and my agent before it was sold, something like that. But as far as, beta readers, I just really find them necessary for me because I really love getting feedback as to what's working, what's not working. And it's not even that if somebody says that's not working, I'm going to necessarily change it. I find that I need something to react to. It's sort of like having a shitty first draft so that you can react to it and you can edit. I feel like if somebody says something to me like, I love this or I don't love this, and here's why, I find that I have a visceral reaction to that. And I'll be like, no, you're wrong. I'm not going to say that, but I'll be thinking it. And just the process that like that to me makes me more sure than if I just read it myself. Because then when I just read it myself, I'm like, I don't know, do I like it? I can't tell. I don't know. I'm just full of indecision. But if somebody says, oh no, that's really bad, then I'll be like, no, you're really wrong. So, so I think that's where it helps me. Yeah.
And Susan, I think maybe you can do the last questions for all of us.
Sure. Oh, we have time for one more.
Or yeah, I think are you saying she should do the last question? Oh,
I should ask the final
you're doing the
question.
last question.
Oh my goodness, I wasn't even ready because I have so many questions just like lying here, waiting for the next time we have a conversation. I mean, I love what you're saying about your process, and so I almost don't want to turn my question back to the book. So I'm going to try to split the difference, which is I do want to say one last thing about this book. I really loved the way you handled race in this book. That's a huge topic. So yes, Here we are with 30 seconds left. I'm going to bring up race.
Yeah.
But maybe there's something about process that you can tie in there, because I felt as if what I loved about the way you handled race was it felt so authentic and organic. Race is not ever in the spotlight in this book because it is just the lived reality of Mia's family. And they live inside of the experience of race in a way that you can't point to it and go like, oh, here's the experience of race in our lives. Their lives are built out of that. it felt I responded to it really powerfully, and it felt like an incredibly it just felt very authentic. And I was wondering if you could just say in the last 30 seconds, does that come out of your kind of occupation of Mia, the way in which you kind of got inside of her and you were like, this is just her lived reality, so she's not going to continually be pointing to it, but you've baked it in to everything.
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, that means a lot to me. You're saying that because I know, you're biracial as well, so that means a lot to me. And my family is, so I'm Korean, my husband's white, our kids are biracial, and I mean, some of the things that come out of this family, I think, are things that I haven't really seen discussed in books. Like, for example, in biracial families, how there are gradations, and like this idea that Mia is treated as Korean because she looks and presents as Korean fully, and whereas John presents as white, so he's treated that way, even in terms of like linguistic expectations. So when they go back to Korea, like the ajumas like kind of treat Mia as if they don't understand why she can't speak Korean, even though they know that John is her twin, and they don't have that expectation of him because they just think of him as, American, which means, white in that culture. And so, things like that, I think, are things that I've lived through and that I notice.
Yeah.
And I think when you notice it and think it and then live it, and then it kind of like stays with you, and you kind of can churn it over in the back of your mind for like, years and decades, I think it comes out in ways that, are expressed in this kind of like way. I mean, I'm thinking about at just now over drinks when you were telling me about your reaction to the footnote about the hierarchy of race, and how what was it? It was the
Mia, one of the wonderful things in this book is that Mia has so much to say that at the beginning she says, I've got a lot to say. I'm going to put the things that aren't really maybe relevant in footnotes, and you can just skip them if you want to. And I found myself underlining so many footnotes.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
don't skip them is my advice. And
But
at
you
one
really
point
can.
in one of the footnotes, Mia's just describing the asymmetrical experiences of her two parents and their in terms of their language capability. So her mother, a Korean woman in the US, not having full fluency, and what that reality is like for her, and how very not symmetrical it is to her white father's experience in Korea not speaking decent Korean. And everybody's like, oh, he's so great. Look at him just trying a little. And the observation that the reason that these things aren't symmetrical is really beautifully articulated.
And that's why, like, for example, people who say like reverse racism, it's like the same thing. That's kind of an explanation for that.
Yeah,
And
no,
I
I
think-
actually literally underlined this footnote, and I wrote in the margin. I was like, no, reverse racism is not the same thing. Like I almost felt like I'd won an argument just because your book had articulated this really beautifully.
Yeah, and I think it's those types of things that, like you live your life, and I've thought about that so much in so many different ways. And then when you put it in context of these families, these characters, I think it comes across as hopefully as more authentic because they come from an authentic experience. And I think that really does goes to the process, right? Which is that sometimes when you do pour a lot of yourself, even the things that are like the kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily write about in an essay form or whatever, that if you put that in there and that you really explore those things through your characters, that I think that will make the stories resonate more, and that they will sort of carry more sort of messages and make people seen, in ways that maybe they wouldn't if they were sort of artificially done through, Googling alone or something like that. Yeah.
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 Well, your characters are very resonant, and the story is, for those of you who haven't read it yet,
Oh,
enthralling.
Thank you.
So you're in luck.
Aw, yay.
Thank you, Angie.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Angie
Oh,
and Susan,
thank
for this wonderful
you.
conversation. As I mentioned earlier, the books are available for sale, and they kindly accepted to sign your copies. So if you can just line up and just wait a little bit as we get ready, that will be great. But thank you again,
And
Angie.
can
and
I say
Susan.
one more thing? I just wanted to thank the Korea Society. Thank you so much for hosting us. Yay. And I also wanted to thank You and Me Books for selling the books. I don't know if everybody is aware, but You and Me Books had a horrible thing happen earlier with a fire, and they're starting to rebuild, and they're reopening in 2 weeks, I think. And so I'm really, really excited for them, and I really, really hope that you guys would support them. They also have Susan's books here, so if you already have a copy of Happiness Falls, you should definitely buy Susan's amazing books. And if you brought copies, since I posted that we would both be signing, we would both love to sign whatever you have. Thank you.